The seller is quite lucky in that he gets to choose the conveyancer, so hopefully his money is nice and safe, yet the purchaser gets the pleasure of paying that conveyancer.
What sort of challenges, could potentially arise in this process for a first-time seller?
When you get the inevitable disputes in a conveyancing matter or in a deceased estates matter, we can provide a full service in terms of resolving issues. It's a bit like your life insurance broker or your mechanic. You have to trust them. So very important to choose a conveyancer that's in the groove and they know what they're doing. Not all lawyers are conveyancers, and even some that are conveyancers are not up to speed with everything that needs to be done.
The conveyancing firm like yourselves, what role do you play in actually helping them resolve those challenges?
What we have found works is if a buyer or a seller is prepared to, when they go down there, it's a new face, and all of a sudden they do get some results.
Neil, thank you so much for joining us today for another one of our episodes for Real Talk SA. I'd love to start by just allowing you to tell us a little bit about yourself, your firm, what it is that you guys do.
We are a specialist firm of conveyancers, and we also do deceased estates. We've been doing it for a hell of a long time now, and we stick to our knitting. We do what we do. I've personally got a background in litigation and commercial work, which I did for 20 years. And then I moved across to the conveyancing space. I think that gives us a great edge in understanding how all of the law fits together, so that when you get the inevitable disputes in a conveyancing matter or in a deceased estates matter, we can provide a full service in terms of resolving issues. We've got 3 offices. Our main office is in Durban North. We've got a Maritzburg lodgement office, and we've also just opened up a Hillcrest office, once again focusing purely on deceased estates and conveyancing.
What sort of challenges, could potentially arise in this process for a first-time seller? And what would you say that the conveyancing firm like yourselves, what role do you play in actually helping them resolve those challenges?
Okay, the challenges can be numerous. It's a human thing. The buyer might not come up with the money. The buyer might get cold feet. The seller might get cold feet. Somebody might die. Which is happening surprisingly often at the moment. So really, I think it's a bit like your life insurance broker or your mechanic. You have to trust them. So very important to choose a conveyancer that's in the groove and they know what they're doing. Not all lawyers are conveyancers, and even some that are conveyancers are not up to speed with everything that needs to be done. So the conveyancer's job has evolved somewhat from 30 years ago. We've now got basically a third world rates department, especially in Durban. Maritzburg is very good, but Durban's rates department is third world. And if the conveyancers don't have a method of trying to rush or improve the turnaround process, that's going to slow the transfer process down. Now, the biggest problem we're having at the moment is getting a rates clearance certificate, and that's a critical document to have to enable transfer to go through. You've got to present that document to the Registrar of Deeds up in Pietermaritzburg. So where sellers sometimes fall down is some of them might have tampered with their meters, water or electricity, and then the rates department won't issue you with a certificate. The challenges that the conveyancers had last year was that the water meters contract expired, so Durban municipality wasn't able to read any water meters, so they weren't issuing any certificates. So as conveyancers, we had to lobby to get this sorted out, and it slowly was sorted out. So it's very much a human process, and we basically look for where it's leaking, and that's where we put effort in. There's a strong contingent, sadly, of my colleagues that are quite happy to bribe the officials. That makes it worse for everybody. And so we resist that. I mean, we're not allowed to do it, and it's certainly not something that I'm prepared to do. I like to sleep at night.
No, exactly. I think, we, especially in our industry, you always have to do everything above board. I also know that a lot of conveyancing firms are actually sending their staff to spend entire days at the rates department, to try and push those deals through.
Yes.
No,
we've done that. We've got a whole array of them, because what happens is once the staff become familiar with one person, they lose their power. What we have found works is if a buyer or a seller is prepared to, when they go down there, it's a new face, and all of a sudden they do get some results. So yeah, I know we've got different. I had a business partner, Mpumi Mayeza. She speaks the language, and she went down there, and she was quite effective for a time, but then she lost her effectiveness. Then we get our marketers are very proactive. They go down there and they jump up and down, and that works. So it's constantly evolving.
And then obviously there would be costs involved, the transfer process and costs.
Yes.
What would the costs be for a seller, for example,
Okay.
for a first-time transfer?
Okay, so the seller is quite lucky in that he gets to choose the conveyancer, so hopefully his money is nice and safe. Yet the purchaser gets the pleasure of paying that conveyancer. And the commission is actually for the seller to pay, but it doesn't come out of his pocket. It comes out of the proceeds of the sale. So the seller's not in for a huge amount of costs. He needs to pay for the 4 certificates I spoke about earlier, wood borer, electricity, gas, and electric fence. And one of the more difficult ones would normally be the wood borer certificate, because quite often houses in this area need to be tented, and that would be a 30,000 Rand job if he's lucky. So he might have to have the cash flow available to do that. Very often sellers don't have that, and we advise them to consider using one of the bridging companies. Their interest rate is very high, but it's meant to be a very short-term loan. Also, what happens is the companies that provide the services for those certificates are often prepared to do the work based on an undertaking from the conveyancer, and we make sure we've got enough money in our proceeds to pay them, and we pay them on transfer. So there are ways and means around cash flow issues. If a seller's got arrear rates, that's a big problem. And normally we advise them to bridge to bring their rates up to date. You can't make an arrangement with the municipality. So if there's 100,000 Rand in rates, the seller needs to find it. Now, what we've often had is there might have been a water leak, or the rates department might have, or the municipality might have made a mistake, or there's a dispute over whether it's the correct amount or not. You can stand on your head, and you're not going to get your transfer if you don't pay that. You pay the amount they want under protest, and then you fight it out afterwards. So if a seller is aware that might be what he has to do, it'll take a hell of a lot of anxiety out of the process.
We was just saying there are so many challenges, and great that we've got firms like yours that can actually hold your hand through the whole process. I think especially when you're doing it for the first time. Earlier we were also saying that we forget sometimes we're dealing with people's emotions. It's a very emotional thing selling your home, especially if it's been your family home for 10 or 15 years. And often the emotion overclouds, the logistical process that goes behind the scenes.
And probably that's focused most powerfully when the time comes to decide what the moving date will be. Most agreements say that the buyer will take occupation on registration of transfer, and that is sadly a moving target, because even if you lodge something in the deeds office, they've got between 7 and 15 days to get it done. So especially when there might be 2 or 3 properties all involved in the same set of transfers, it's almost impossible for that to happen as the agreements are drafted. I still recommend drafting the agreements like that, and closer to the time what you do is you sit down with the parties, and if there is a problem, we'll help them to negotiate, we'll mediate, and then we do an addendum where we actually create a strike date, because for somebody to move out and move in one day is impossible.
It's a big challenge. And then obviously your occupational rent would form part of that agreement, payable to the seller.
Yes, or it depends on if the person that owns the property is not the one that's in occupation. It could be either buyer or seller. The person that doesn't own it anymore, or hasn't started owning it yet, has to pay occupational rental. And hopefully it would normally be a couple of days, and there's a lot of scope. Just another point, that's where I strongly recommend that agents, when they fill in the sale agreement, while everybody's friendly with each other, discuss occupational rental and put an amount in. Often people say, well, we're only moving in on transfer, so there will be no occupational rental, so don't worry about it. It very seldom works out like that. And the parties need to understand at the beginning, it could be them receiving or paying. When it gets to the end where one of them's receiving and one of them's paying, so all of a sudden it's not so easy to negotiate an amount, because there'll be different expectations. So strong advice to the agents, fill in an amount of occupational rental when you do the agreement, because you'll find it far easier to negotiate closer to transfer date.
We actually, in our agreements, it's almost like a compulsory field.
Good.
It has to be in there,
Yeah.
because trying to negotiate after the fact with all the parties involved becomes very, very difficult. Great.
And emotions tend to run higher closer to transfer. So yes, get as much of the negotiations out of the way, and then we worry about the important stuff closer to the time.
So there's also a lot of costs involved in the transfer process. If you can maybe just share a little bit more on the costs in this process.
Before we even get to the costings, I think we need the public to understand that in any conveyancing process, there's most likely to be 3 different transactions involving 3 different conveyancing firms that all need to be collated together at one time in the deeds office. Reason for this: if the seller's got a bond, his bond will need to be cancelled when he sells the property, and the bank that holds that bond will nominate a firm of attorneys on their panel to cancel the bond. That is a cost for the seller, and it's in the region of about 5,000 rand. So it's not a massive cost. If the buyer's getting a bond, he's going to have his bank nominate their own conveyancer to be the bond registration attorney, and obviously the transferring attorney will deal with the transfer between the buyer and the seller. The buyer will therefore be in for 2 sets of costs if he's getting a bond. Very often they don't realize this, and these costs are based on a government legislated tariff that generally goes up once a year. And it's not a linear thing. It goes up on a sliding scale, and the more expensive the property is, the higher the percentages. It sounds counterintuitive, but that's just how it works. But so the tariff for the transferring attorney and the bond attorney are identical in terms of the conveyancing fee. The transferring costs are always much more because there's a terrible thing called transfer duty, and that's a tax to the government, and you can't get away from that. So, and that transfer duty also goes up on a sliding scale. So the more expensive the property is, the bigger the percentage you pay. So, one needs to take advice before one signs a sale agreement to make sure that one has the funds available to pay for this, especially from the purchaser's point of view. And the conveyancer can't do his job if these funds aren't paid, especially the transferring attorney. If he isn't given the money to pay the transfer duty, you can't deal with SARS, you can't get a transfer duty receipt, and the Registrar of Deeds wants to see a transfer duty receipt. So it becomes quite critical. By way of example, I've got our tariff booklet which we use, and if you're buying a property at less than R1 million, you're fortunate in that there is no transfer duty. So transfer duty only kicks in from R1 million and up. But to give you an example of the sliding scale, if you buy a property for R1 million, the tariff fee for the conveyancer is 24,000 rand plus VAT, plus certain other costs, not much. If you're buying one for 4 million rand, that jumps up to 54,000 rand. So it's quite a big jump. And sadly, your transfer duty will be 237,000 rand. So, for 4 million rand, a buyer will be in for at least 302,000 rand, whereas for R1 million rand sale price, it'll be 29,000 rand. Now, the next issue is the issue of discounts. Conveyancers would dearly love not to give discounts because, it's expensive to run a conveyancing department, and your staff are very well paid, especially if you've got good quality staff. But there is scope for the conveyancer to offer a discount, especially if it's a long outstanding client of the firm. And very often what we find is buyers will ask for their own conveyancer because their conveyancer will give them a very generous discount. We tend to counter that by saying you don't have the choice, but don't worry, we will negotiate a reasonable discount with you, with a view to keeping everybody happy. At the end of the day, both the agent and the conveyancer wants a happy buyer and seller because they will become buyers and sellers in the future.
In terms of paying over monies to the attorney firms, that's quite a hot topic as well, just with all the fraud that we're seeing, for a while, actually. It's not a new thing. What would your advice be when somebody needs to pay like a deposit or a cash amount over to the attorneys?
Don't trust any emails. We nearly lost 700,000 rand about 4 years ago. It happens regularly, and it's a big fight as to whose fault it is. It's inevitably nobody's fault, but somebody's server or email address gets hacked, and sadly that's where it lies. Gmail addresses are a huge problem. So if I was a purchaser, I'd be very wary of communicating through Gmail because that the hackers have a sort of open season on that. And be very alert to any emails which change bank details, whether it looks as official as can be. We will never change our bank details, and we've got a warning at the bottom of our email. But if a hacker gets through our firewalls and manages to send that to a purchaser who is naive, who's never done this before, they might end up, or their Gmail could be hacked, and they might end up paying 2 million rand to a con man. So just be hugely alert to it. The conveyancing area is a perfect target for these con people because large sums of money are being paid and the emails can be intercepted. Don't trust emails and rather make a telephone call. Make sure you're phoning the correct the firm. Don't rely on the false email with the false telephone number. Phone the firm, speak to the paralegal or the bookkeeper or the partner concerned and confirm verbally. In my experience, WhatsApps tend to be quite safe as well. So what I often do is I'll say to somebody on an email, I'll send you my bank details over WhatsApp. I don't know of any instances where that's been hacked. So yeah, it's about constantly being alert. The bad guys are clever, and they're always finding new intricate ways to take our money away. And we don't think it's a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So we're just all of us extremely alert, but it's a big fear.
No, it's a very, very scary thought. We've also exactly that instilled the procedure of phoning and actually asking the conveyancer to read back the details that they have or vice versa. Some of our clients have also said, listen, I'm not comfortable paying the whole 1 million up front. I'm just going to do one transfer first of 100 rand and see if it reaches you successfully.
Yes. That is an excellent idea. Because that's another fail-safe. There would have been a telephone call, and even if that telephone call was somehow manipulated, you can't argue with 100 rand in the conveyancer's bank account, whether it's there or not, whether it's not.
Excellent. You've answered all my questions. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners and our audience?
Yes, I would. One of the... And this is not a hard and fast rule, but generally it's not a good idea for a seller to allow early occupation to a purchaser. Don't forget that we're all selling second-hand houses. Some of them might be 50 to 100 years old. They're not perfect, and that's why you've got something called a Voetstoots clause, which basically means that the purchaser is buying the property as is, much like a second-hand motor car would be. Now, when purchasers move in, they start finding mistakes, and if they're not yet the owner, one of the very common factors that hits us as the conveyancers is the purchaser says, stop the transfer. Or he says, hold back money. And we're just not allowed to do that because we belong to both. We act for buyer, we act for seller. If a purchaser asks us to hold back funds to, for example, fix a crack, we've got to ask the seller if he's prepared to do that. And if he says no, there's a problem. Now, the purchasers normally then say, well, transfer must stop. And we can't stop the transfer. We use the agreement as our guide and our reference. And unless the agreement says that you can do that, which I've never seen one that does that, we basically have to proceed with the transfer. So very often you might find a highly disappointed purchaser who blames the conveyancer for siding with the seller. All in all, generally not a good idea, but it happens maybe 20 to 30% of the time. So it can't be an absolute adamant no, but try and avoid that if you can.
And then if anybody would like to reach out to Tate Nolan and Knight for any advice or, anything like that, where would be the best place for them to get hold of you?
Well, probably our main office in Durban. The telephone number is 031 563 1874. My cell phone number 082 808 6281. And we operate on a very hands-on approach. Anybody in the firm is able to be spoken to about any matter. We don't know each other's matters, but we can, we've got a very flat organizational structure, and we've been through hell together with COVID and all of those things. So we're a tight-knit team, and we thoroughly enjoy what we do, and we get quite excited when things go well. Yeah.
It's great. So we'll also put that information in the comments below. So thank you so much for joining us today. We really, really appreciate your time, and we'll definitely see you on another episode, hopefully.
Fantastic, Mia. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Neil.